I'm about to show you a 3-part framework for expanding a fantasy novel that feels too short, without making it feel boring or slow-paced. If you look at my most recent book, Kingdom of Dragons, you might not think that I had a problem with this issue of underwriting in my career. This book is 688 pages long, and the book before this one, Siege of Trebelin, is 280,000 words in total. However, earlier on in my writing career, I was actually a bit of an underwriter, and with the first draft of Across the Broken Stars, this clocked in at only 60,000 words long, or about 260 pages total. But by using the 3-part expansion framework that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video, I was able to add an extra 20,000 words to this story, taking it up to a final page count of 350. And the best part is that I've actually read a lot of reviews from readers saying how much they enjoyed these new scenes that I added into the story as I was going through that editing process. So when it comes to making your fantasy novel longer, you want to start with expansion principle number 1. Smooth out your character arcs. Most great fantasy books are about a person wanting something, struggling to get that thing, and being forced to change as a result of those struggles and their pursuit. A character arc refers to that process of change. And understanding character arcs is crucial to shaping and controlling the length of your story. To explain why that is, I need to give you a bit of background on what a character arc actually is. There are 3 types of character arcs you can write in your story. A positive arc where a character gets better, a negative arc where a character gets worse, and a flat arc where the focus is not so much on your character's change, but rather on how they change the world around them. To define your character's arc, you want to map out the following 5 details. Number 1 is your character's ghost. This is a formative event that happened to shape your character's worldview and has led to them having perhaps an incorrect assumption about how the world actually operates. Usually this is an event that has some kind of trauma attached to it, but that's not always the case. It simply just has to be something that was very influential on shaping your character's beliefs. For example, you might have a character who grew up in a very poor family. Growing up in that situation was your character's ghost, and it has drastically informed their beliefs about money and society and the world. The second component of a character's arc is the lie. So the lie is a mistruth about the world your character has formed as a result of the ghost. In the case of our example character here, who grew up in a poor family, his lie might be that you need to be really rich in order to be happy in this world. Now, as a result of your character's ghost and lie, this leads to the third component of your character's arc, which is the want. So what thing does your character want that they believe will make them feel a sense of completeness? For our example character here who grew up in this poor family, the thing they want is financial wealth. In reality, however, your character does not require the want in order to feel complete. What they actually need is the 4th component of your character arc, which is their need. So in contrast to the want, which is the thing that they think will make them feel complete, the need is the thing that will actually give them this sense of completeness. For our example character, he might come to realize that he actually doesn't need to be rich. What he actually needs is to form a genuine, loving connection with his own wife and his own children. And this leads to the 5th and final component of a character arc, which is your character's truth. Your truth refers to the belief that your character needs to accept in order to vanquish their lie and their want and to fully achieve their need. Our example character's truth might be that true happiness lies through the relationships you have with other people, not through money. If you are writing a positive arc, your character begins by believing the lie and by pursuing the want, and over the course of the story, we will see them shift to eventually end up in a place where they believe the truth and they have their need. If you're writing a negative arc, you reverse that pattern instead. Now, I have a full 70-minute video going into writing character arcs in much more detail, which I will link to at the very end of this video. But when it comes to expanding your fantasy novel, here is the crucial thing that you need to understand about your character arcs. If your book feels too short right now, it is probably because there is not enough meaningful challenge between the start and the end of your character's transformation in your story. They are changing too quickly. Instead, what you need to be doing is looking for a way to make that change feel more gradual and realistic and natural. The way I like to think about it is when you're changing characters too rapidly, it feels like they're just doing these 180-degree turns on the spot. It's very abrupt and very jerking. What you really want to be doing in your story is giving characters these little 10-degree nudges, just turning them 10 degrees at a time, until by the end of the story we realize that they have made a complete revolution and they are now facing 180 degrees in the opposite direction. For example, let's say your character starts off the story being quite selfish, but but ends your story by being quite brave and sacrificing themselves for someone else in the climax. So if I was to expand that story, I'd be looking at how we can have moments of gradual change to foreshadow and progress the character towards that behavior shift in the conclusion. Maybe your character gives to charity for the first time, or we see a scene where they are sharing food with someone else, which is not something they would have done at the start of the story. Or maybe they protect their friend from a bully in some kind of verbal conflict. All those moments I've just described there could form the kernel of new scene ideas that allow you to meaningfully add to the length of your story in a way that doesn't feel like padding, doesn't feel like it's boring for readers, because it's actually developing your characters and it's making their change feel more interesting to read about. Before we get into the second principle for expanding your fantasy book, I want to mention that I actually have a free 5-day course all about how to write better characters in your fantasy novel. Sign up for free using the link in the description down below, and you will learn some of the most important and useful techniques about character development that I have learned through the process of writing 4 fantasy novels and through personally coaching 35 writers to help them improve their stories. The second principle for expanding your fantasy novel is to increase your try-fail cycles. When your character tries to achieve something, almost all of the time they should either succeed but now face a new problem. We call this a yes, but, or they should fail and the situation actually gets worse. We call this a no and. For an example of a yes but, imagine that your character successfully manages to find a magical artifact. That is a yes. But the artifact is carrying a curse that is now affecting your character, and they have to figure out how to solve this curse that is affecting them. That is your but. For an example of a no and, let's say there's a scene where your character attempts to summon Death with a capital D in order to bring her husband back from the underworld. However, the ceremony goes wrong, so that's your no, and Death manages to claw your magician main character into the underworld, forcing her to complete a series of trials to win her freedom and return to the land of the living. That is a no, the character did not succeed with this thing, and things got worse for them. They're now faced with new difficulties and complications. Now that cycle I just described of a character trying to get a thing and then either succeeding or failing to get that thing, but then having to face new difficulties and complications after, that is a try-fail cycle. And your story is really just comprised of dozens or maybe even hundreds of try-fail cycles stacked one after the other until you get to a moment in your story where you just give the reader a yes and there is no but at the end of it. And that yes is the climax and the final resolution of your story, beyond which there are no further complications for your character to solve. By the way, if you are linking your scenes together with and then instead of yes but or no and, your plot is probably boring. That's because there's no sense of causality and there's no sense of this chain of cause and effect that's leading from the start to the end of your novel. When you're linking your scenes together with just and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, it just feels incredibly boring, and it just feels like we are reading about a procession of things that have no cause to be linked together in a narrative fashion. So how do try-fail cycles help you to expand your novel if it's too short right now? Well, if your novel's too short right now, you probably need to add more try-fail cycles. Because right now, the chances are pretty high that your characters are attempting to achieve their goals and they are almost always succeeding right away with no real sense of difficulty or setbacks to face. What you need to do is build more adversity into your story so that characters have to work harder to reach their goals. However, it is very, very important, and I cannot overstate this enough, to make sure that all of your try-fail cycles still relate back to the central plot and the central ideas of your story. Otherwise, you're going to be creating a bunch of pointless diversions that make readers irritated that they're having to read about these things that have nothing to do with the story you promised them in your introduction. Let's run through an example of how to correctly add more try-fail cycles to your story. Let's imagine you have a scene right now where your characters have to break into a castle to retrieve and steal this magical sword that's inside. Now, right now in your story, let's pretend in your first draft that your characters get into the castle, they manage to sneak through it without any real resistance, they find the artifact, but then the guards catch them and they have to fight their way out of the castle using the magical abilities of the sword before they can escape back out into the city. Now, that scene could work perfectly fine the way I described it, but if you wanted to lengthen your story and increase the try-fail cycles that your characters are facing, here is how you could do it. First of all, you could maybe have a scene where your characters attempt to find the architect who designed the castle, and they try to get her drunk so that she will reveal the plans for the castle so that they can learn if there's any secret passages they can use to sneak in. Once they've got that intel, they then maybe say to themselves, okay, we need to figure out a way to get past the demon guards that are protecting the palace. And the only way we can get past them is if we convince this magician over here to gift us with a particular invisibility magic that only they can use. So now they have to go off and they have to convince this character to help them, either through blackmail or through appealing to their better nature or through paying them or through threats or some other means. Then when it comes to the actual heist scene, maybe something goes wrong as the crew is sneaking into the castle and they get caught by the guards, and this crew member has to pretend that they were summoned to the castle for a secret meeting with the Queen in order to avoid getting killed on the spot. I could go on further here, but what you can clearly see is that all of these try-fail cycles are relating to the story's core, to the core of trying to sneak into this castle to retrieve this magical item. These try-fail cycles all relate to a goal that readers actually care about, and that really is the critical thing to keep in mind whenever you're wanting to increase the number of try-fail cycles in your fantasy novel. This brings us to the third principle for expanding your fantasy book, which is to beef up your subplots. Adding more subplots is one of the easiest ways to expand your story's length, but you do have to be very careful with how you go about this. A bad subplot will feel like an annoying distraction and may even cause your readers to abandon your story entirely. So, what actually makes a good subplot? This is something I'm considering making a full video on, so let me know in the comments down below if you would like to see that. But to boil it down to the basics, a good subplot explores the central theme or the central ideas of your story from a new angle that adds depth to your main plot. For example, in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, there is a subplot involving the Hippogriff Buckbeak, who must face an unfair trial for attacking Draco Malfoy. This explores the corruption of justice and the law in the wizarding world. And it also mirrors the main plot, which all revolves around how Sirius Black was framed for the murder of Peter Pettigrew. Let me show you how I use this same principle of beefing up your subplots to expand across the Broken Stars. And it's worthwhile remembering here that I define theme as a moral argument that is explored in different ways by the characters throughout your story. It's not about forcing a particular idea or political message down readers' throats. It's quite the opposite of that. It is simply about giving readers a complex moral question that is explored in lots of different ways throughout the course of your story, giving it a great sense of depth and making the story feel like it's really about something. So when it came to expanding the subplots in Across the Broken Stars, I said to myself that, okay, I've got my main character Leon, who is on this quest to find a mythical safe haven that may or may not exist, to seek sanctuary for both himself and this young fugitive girl that he is helping to try to find this place. And throughout this quest, we're going to see Leon go from being cowardly and selfish at the start of the story to becoming much braver and far more selfless as the story and his own quest for this location progresses. And so that main plot is exploring this idea of redemption pretty directly. But how else could I actually explore this? To give some quick context here, this story takes place in a space fantasy setting where people live on these discs that float in space, and the discs are protected by these domed force fields that keep gravity and air inside them. But if you step out of the force field, you enter back into the vacuum of space, and unless you have some special breathing apparatus, which is powered by these kind of fungal entities in this world, then you're basically going to die. And to bulk up this story, I added a sequence where Leon, who is my main character, and Alina, who is the young fugitive girl who he is trying to help find this mythical safe haven, I added a sequence where they get stranded on a disc that is occupied by a bunch of these religious cult-like fanatics who are trying to martyr themselves by throwing pieces of their own bodies and of other people's bodies into a volcano on this quite backwater disc that is in the middle of nowhere. And the reason why this kind of cult of martyrs is doing this is to try to win the approval of the archangels, who are the kind of mythical gods of this world or a former spacefaring race, depending on how you interpret the story. And these martyrs are also doing this to seek a kind of repentance and penance for the fact that their country was colonized 20 years ago by this other conquering nation. This leads to a pretty tense scene. And not only does it show another aspect of the story's world building, but it also relates back to the story's central theme in a very direct way. These crazy cultists are essentially showing a perverse, kind of dark side of the story's central theme that redemption is possible through sacrificing yourself for an ideology that is bigger than your own ego. This in turn makes Leon question his own changing beliefs and adds a great layer of moral complexity and depth to the story by reflecting back on the main plot in an interesting way. Now, like I mentioned earlier in the video, mastering your character's arcs is essential to controlling the length of your story and also controlling your reader's emotional experience. So if you want to learn how to write captivating character arcs, then check out this video over here. Keep writing and keep striving.